All right, let's get started. Thank you everybody again for taking the time out to spend this afternoon with us. We're going to be talking today about the three pillars of hiring success: quality, speed, and equity. But before I do, just a couple of housekeeping tips. First of all, thank you again for being with us. We absolutely love questions. Please feel free to ask us any number of questions. You can do that in the chat functionality. You can do that using the Q&A panel in your Zoom webinar. We're definitely going to keep time towards the end of the webinar to answer these questions. But if you ask us something that is pertinent to what we are talking about right at that minute, we'll also take some questions as we go through this webinar. And lastly, this presentation and the recording of the webinar will be distributed afterwards. So don't worry about taking any screenshots or notes. You're going to get all this content, and we'd much rather you, interact with us, make this conversational, and ask us a bunch of questions. And with that, I am delighted to introduce my panel today. Very glad to be joined by Mick and Chris. Mick and Chris have over 25 years of experience in HR and recruiting tech. And both of them have had firsthand experience optimizing hiring through some innovative tactics, but specifically as it pertains to quality, speed, and equity. Mick, Chris, welcome. Mick, if you wouldn't mind saying a quick hello and introducing yourself to our audience.
Thank you, Pankaj. Yeah. So I've spent the better part of the last 15, 16 years in the legal compliance and human resource in the areas in senior leadership roles. Most recently, I was the Chief Compliance Officer for Advantage Solutions, responsible for global compliance, global human resources, global training, and global quality. So fair amount of experience, both positive and negative, and we're happy to share some of that with you here today. So with that, I'll toss it to Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Hey everybody, and Pankaj, thanks for having me today. Chris Johnson. I work on the industry strategy and market development team over at Checkr, and kind of like Mick, I've been in and around HR tech, HR outsourcing for 23 years. I just had a birthday, so I'm probably getting close to 24 years now. And most recently here at Checkr, I've been with Checkr for about 4 years. And previous to that, I was the head of digital operations at the Adecco Group, working behind the curtain, launching their two-sided marketplace, Adia. And Pankaj, was actually when I first met you. It was my time at Adecco.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Chris. Glad to have you here. And for those of you who have not met me, my name is Pankaj. I'm one of the founders of Sense. We started Sense about 7 years ago with a mission to build the first end-to-end talent engagement platform. We've stayed really true to that mission. We today work with over 700 customers, and the Sense platform is used by over 40,000 recruiters every single day to influence 3 million hires every year. Our main aim today is to talk about what can lead to hiring success in obviously a pretty competitive and an ever-changing market. So what we will talk about are these three key pillars, quality, speed, and equity. What are some of the challenges when it comes to each of those three, and how can you solve or at least have technology and automation help you with those challenges? And along the way, we'll take questions, and we'll also keep some time for Q&A towards the end. So I'll introduce our sort of topic for today. As hopefully most of you will agree, overall hiring success essentially comprises of three core pillars. You all probably know quality and speed. Quality is just how do you use an omni-channel engagement strategy, connect with the best candidates available. You want to find the best person for the job. But speed dictates that you find that person quickly. Can you progress through each hiring stage, and can you fill this role as quickly as possible before either your competitor will, or before this candidate would go off the market, or before they change their mind, so on and so forth. And then equity is all about giving fair and equal treatment to every applicant during this process and ensuring that everybody has a positive candidate experience. Each of these three pillars require different processes, require different outcomes, but together they create the skeleton, the backbone of a successful hiring process. Now, I think you'll agree with me when I say that quality and speed have long been priorities for all TA leaders. Equity is, however, a little bit of a newer priority, and it is worth talking about that in a little bit more detail. So, first of all, why does equity matter? I mean, why does it matter if you can fill a role quickly with a quality candidate? Why should you even care about this? Well, first of all, keep in mind that quality candidates today have multiple employment options, and they'll withdraw themselves from consideration if they've had even a minor sort of negative or poor experience. So you want to make sure that your candidate experience is absolutely key. Your candidate experience is white glove. And of course, if they did that, they might talk about that publicly on Glassdoor or other sort of social review websites, and that's going to hurt your ability to get quality candidates in the future. And then, equity in itself highlights that your culture is welcoming. You're an inclusive place to work. You give everybody equal opportunity. And it's probably not a surprise to any of you that candidates today value diversity, equity, and inclusion more than they've before ever. So in some senses, you've got to basically give everybody a fair, positive experience. So before we get into it, Chris, maybe you can talk about this a little bit more. But what are some of the other reasons that are leading to companies that are now prioritizing equity?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it right here, right? So the employment brand sitting right up there, a competitive candidate market, retention is the right thing to do. To me, this all points back to social alignment. And I think it's one of those sort of like soft things that happens in HR that a lot of people forget about. And, unfortunately, right, we all have some level of unconscious bias. It's, do I like Italian food versus Mexican food? Like, you know what I mean? It's out there. We all have it. And it can very rapidly and almost kind of quietly work its way into the hiring process. And unfortunately, it can do it without any warning signs. So I think what you're seeing now is that companies are starting to pay attention to something that's always been there, right? For the most part, it's benign. It's not a big deal. Obviously, there's really gross examples of unconscious bias, but for the most part, we're talking about the smaller things. One of the examples that I use all the time is fish and game. I'm a big sportsman. I'm very sensitive to animals and animal cruelty type situations. So as benign as that is to the organization, I can still inject that into a hiring process if we're not careful. So I think now the EQ of companies has really started to kind of go to the next level. And it's really coming from two different spaces. I think it's coming from the board down, right? I think everybody's sort of talking about it. And it's like, hey, CHROs, CEOs, the boards, the investors are saying we need to be smarter about this. But the point I'm trying to make is that the candidates are also asking for it too, right? We're now beginning to interview folks on Glassdoor, and we're actually, or shouldn't say folks, but interviewing companies, and we're starting to look at them and saying, hey, is this important to them? Is the company making the right efforts to ensure that they have unbiased and fair hiring practices? Because we all, any one of us, right? So any gender, any race, any background, we all have the potential to be impacted by bias. So the companies that are starting to prioritize that, I think, really kind of rise to the top of the list. So we're in this highly competitive candidate market. And this is just another one of those things, sort of like, back in the day it was, do you have flexible work? Yes, you were super exotic. Do I have flex time? Then it was sort of unlimited vacation. These are all the things that sort of made you rise to the top of this sort of social alignment and social benefits. Then it became corporate citizenship. So are you doing good things out there in space from an organization and sort of a nonprofit standpoint? Now, I think this is just that next iteration. And are you focusing on these things to ensure that you're hiring fairly, that I'm going to be safe, and that my peers are going to be safe? So yeah, I think it's a bit of a softer pressure than what people may be thinking.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, there is a lot of conversation about unconscious bias. So, thanks for introducing that into our conversation today, because I'm sure we'll expand on that. But Mick, I also wanted to ask you, I mean, you've obviously spent the better part of your life being the buyer, right? So you're actually on the buy side of things. Can you talk about the business impact of, why one should prioritize equity in the hiring process?
Well, yeah, and I think Chris, did a fantastic job of covering a fair amount of that. But let's be honest, nobody gets up in the morning to go to work, to do a bad job, and to lose money. At least I hope they don't. If they do, I hope they're not working for me. But the whole point of hiring anybody is to get the best candidate. And you would like them to come to work every day, be productive. And the only reason to hire somebody is that they come to work and they generate revenue for you. If you're not hiring the right person, if you're, well, the bottom line is if you're not being equitable, you're not gonna generate the revenue that you're looking for, and the company is going to end up struggling against its competition. You're not going to get the right number of hires that you're looking for. And let's think about in the hiring process as well that as you're going through in my past experiences, we had some large volume hiring, and you might think that you've hired 25 people to fill 25 roles. But if you've got a lot of this bias that Chris is talking about, you may only have 15 people show up for work, and now you've got a tremendous gap in your budget, right? So equity is critically important. It's protecting your corporate reputation, as is mentioned on here, and frankly, it's just the right thing to do. But the bottom line is, not having equity on the business side just negatively affects your revenue. Let's just be very practical about it. I don't think it's rocket science. I think it's very basic.
Right? It's quality of the work product, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole point is you show up, you do a good job, and you generate revenue for the company. If you don't have equity, you're not going to get any of that.
Yep. So, I mean, this is a pretty good preamble, I think, to talk about, what our audience is here today for. Obviously, there are three pillars now. I think all agree, you've got to focus on quality, you've got to focus on speed, but you've got to focus on these in a fashion that you are equitable. All right, we've got to do that. But, there are challenges in getting all three of these things right. I mean, you absolutely have heard these from the recruiters all the time. A combination of these two pillars can sometimes be prioritized over the third. Or heck, just one pillar can be prioritized over everything. I found this great candidate, let me just, or I found this candidate who can sort of tick some boxes. Let me just hire them because the hiring manager is breathing down my neck. And that's just around speed. Or sometimes taking weeks and weeks and months to find that perfect sort of diamond in the rough candidate and, essentially prioritizing for quality over everything else. So obviously there are challenges around each one of these pillars. And what I want us to get into is talk about what are the challenges with quality, what are the challenges with speed, what are the challenges with equity, what are some of the tangible ways technology and automation can help you solve those. But let's start defining some of those challenges. So firstly, let's start talking about just finding quality talent. So I'll start by telling you a couple of statistics. First of all, people obviously have multiple job options today, as is not a surprise to anybody. But there is data that suggests that when people are looking for a job, when they're saying, okay, I'm going to go find myself a new job, they're literally applying to 12 jobs at once. It is so easy to apply for a job now. It can be done with a single click. You can apply with LinkedIn, you can apply with Indeed, you can apply with several different online, resumes, profiles that you've already pre-stored, that you could apply for a job in a single click. So, candidates have multiple different options. So if you want quality talent, you have to make sure that, you're immediately interacting with them. You're essentially making sure that, you're grabbing their attention before somebody else is. Second, talent today absolutely prioritizes other factors on top of compensation. People want work-life balance, people want a flexible work schedule, people actually want everything we're talking about, which is, hey, do you guys value diversity, so on and so forth. So again, for you to find quality candidates, you have to sort of meet all of those criteria. And then this is the other thing that I talk about a lot. I mean, with some exceptions, people typically, and you guys are examples of that, end up working 5, 7, 10 years in a role. And, you typically work 30, 40, 50 years in your life. You're probably going to change a job 5 to 6 times. And, at that point, you essentially want to make sure that this is the perfect job for you. You probably want to talk to a human being, so on and so forth. So anyway, my point is, there is It's hard to judge somebody until you meet them, until you find out what their quality is. So there are all these challenges in finding quality talents. But Mick, maybe you can talk about what are some of the other challenges when it comes to attracting qualified candidates.
Well, I think it's a very much, this is a unique period in American history, I think, coming out of a pandemic that perhaps we haven't seen the likes of, well, certainly I think in probably any of our lifetimes. I'm not a young man anymore, and I've not gone through anything like what we've gone through with the COVID. And I think it changed paradigms dramatically. It went from you show up for work, you show up at 7:30 if you're scheduled at 8, and if you're supposed to get off at 5, you leave at 5:30, and you be very grateful for that paycheck that the company's given you, to, gosh, it's about 8:15. I should probably go to my office and, I'm gonna put on my TV and, check into my Zoom calls, and, oh, it's 3 o'clock. I've got that doctor's appointment I've got to run to. And I'm being a little sarcastic, but there's a lot of research that says just a tremendous amount of our country really doesn't want to go to work anymore. So not only is there tremendous competition for the folks who are out there looking for work, I think a significant portion of what used to be the traditional workforce no longer exists. Certainly not right now. They may come back as refrigerators continue to empty or what have you. But I find that there is a dwindling number of folks out there who have kind of, let's call it that old-fashioned work ethic. It's a different world that we exist in now, and if we don't adapt as companies, we're going to struggle to hire people. So you've got to look at the work-at-home model. Although I did see I saw an interview last night from a very famous author I won't mention, who said people are getting sick and tired of working at home. I get that. I think a sense of community and a sense of purpose is very, very important. I think, that goes back to our equity conversation that we had. But I think we've got to be creative. The old put an ad in a newspaper, put an ad on LinkedIn, put an ad on Indeed, that's not going to work. We'll get into it a little bit later, but creativity, originality is going to be the key to succeeding, but also understanding who your new employee is and how valuable each and every one of them are.
Yeah, no, super helpful. So, I think where I want to go next is maybe talk about how, you can essentially use some of the technology that is on your hands today, to essentially solve for quality. So here are some solutions that I'm offering, and obviously I'll come to you guys as experts to talk more about it. But first, you can absolutely automate all the tedious tasks that recruiters do today using automation, using technology. We talk about this a lot. Only a third of a recruiter's time today is actually spent in talking to a human being. They're spending the remaining 2/3 in just prospecting, administrative tasks, keeping up reporting, keeping up applicant tracking systems, so on and so forth. So first of all, you can give them a huge respite by essentially saying, we're going to automate that. Secondly, I've seen dozens and dozens of organizations who now do a time study, and they essentially find out what their recruiters are doing all day. I mean, this is not to find out if they're browsing or going on YouTube or whatever. This is just to see where are they spending their time. And after studying recruiters for 30 days, they find out that 70 to 80% of their time is being spent in tasks that can all be automated today. Oftentimes 20% of your time is just spent in scheduling an interview and rescheduling an interview, stuff that can be all done automatically. So one easy fix sounds like you can take tedious tasks away from recruiters so they can have more talk time with candidates. They can have more talk time with hiring managers to find quality candidates. Second, you can use AI to screen candidates. I mean, we've all been here. Every place you're basically asking the same exact questions, right? I mean, do you have the skill? How much money do you want? How many years of experience do you have? Do you have a driver's license? Can you show up for work here? I mean, every recruiter is going to ask the same 4 or 5 questions. And when you think about a high volume environment where you're hiring a lot of people, it becomes even more than that, where 90% of your questions are repetitive, and this can be done by AI. And then lastly, you can expand your sourcing channels. I mean, using technology, you can ask 1 million people who are sitting in your database, hey, send me an employee referral, because technology will help you track all of that. It will also help you pay any of those 1 million people who do send you a referral and somebody gets hired. So there are many different ways in which technology can help you increase the quality of your top of the funnel, as well as increase the amount of time that recruiters have available to talk to candidates. So, Chris, I'll throw this back at you. What are your thoughts? I mean, are there solutions you would recommend that can help increase the number of qualified candidates in your pipeline?
Yeah, there's tons. We could sit here and have a technical solutioning call for the next 30 minutes, but I want to rewind just a touch, because I have an interesting perspective on this. I want to get back to something you said, Pankaj, right? Talent today prioritizes other factors over compensation, things like work-life balance, flexible work schedules, et cetera. Well, I think if you really dig into there's a great article that just came out, the Washington Post. It's on Gen Z, and it talks about Gen Z doesn't want to be blocked into cubicles. Really cool validation to some of these points, and it's something that I've been seeing for some time. And what I mean by that is, like, that old interview question of, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I think it's honestly kind of out the door now. It's more like, where do you see yourself in 1 year, right? And how are you going to actually begin to create stretch opportunities for candidates to kind of evolve their skills? Because that really is a modern candidate. I think, we look at Gen Z. I have a 19-year-old son. And if I look at him, I think he really is the prototype for the modern candidate. So they're looking for opportunities to climb the skills map versus ripping up through the org chart. So if you don't have a plan for growth and internal mobility, I think you're honestly 100% missing out on the best talent, because you've already paid the burden to get them through the door. And if they're bored or not feeling super optimized, they're going to start looking outside. So I would begin with looking at redeployment or internal mobility. Sort of depends on your industry, right? Are you in recruitment? Are you in staffing? Because it's literally, you're kind of sitting on a gold mine. So What I would do is begin to invest in smarter, more intelligent outreach tools. You need to go out there and understand, like, what you're hearing. So what does Chris want to do? What is Chris working on? What does Chris want to do? I've been at Checkr for 4 years. Has that changed? Has it moved? Have I learned something new? And then you capture that. And then you begin to index that, and you start to capitalize on that because you already have them. So it's almost like you need to go to the bottom of the funnel to go to the top of the funnel first. Because if not, the most important asset you have, which is your people, they're going to walk at the door because they're bored. It happens all the time. And that's what you really saw in the Great Resignation. So it's a really simple problem to solve, but it takes a very deliberate effort. So from like a technical standpoint, I personally think conversational AI is the best way to do this, right? We use it so strategically in the recruitment cycle, but it sort of falls down a little bit when you get into your internal recruitment cycle. So I would urge everybody to take a look at that and say, what are you doing with the folks that are sitting inside your house? But to answer the question more directly, yeah, if you're going top of the funnel, definitely pay attention to the human factor. Candidates are smarter than ever. Every single one of us on this call, everybody in the audience, we've all been conditioned to research every single thing that we do. So I don't know about you guys, but if you think about it, I won't even walk into a restaurant unless I go read a review somewhere, even if it's just a Google review. I'm looking at it, 3 stars, 4 stars, what's everybody saying? So the position you're trying to fill, you really kind of got to take a look at the candidates that you're targeting and what their preferences are, kind of like that Google review. So figure out if, are you looking for me? Are you looking for my son? Am I applying for jobs on LinkedIn? That's where I'm looking. My son's looking on TikTok and Instagram. So understanding that and then taking the requisition to where they're at and using some of the commercial technology that's sitting out there. And then also kind of digging back in and figuring out, are you selling the job? Are you selling your company? Are you selling both? And then actually, how are you selling that? Because my son and I are 2 different consumers. Requisitions aren't one size fits all, much like, resumes aren't one size fits all. So, kind of going back to the top of the conversation too, I think be bullish on all of that stuff. How are you presenting yourself? Be bullish on those soft benefits, because everybody's really taking a look at, they're looking at that stuff now. So if you are kind of just like boilerplating recs that are sitting out there and boilerplating them across your entire organization on those different channels, you most likely are missing the top talent because they're way more sophisticated than they were, even 5 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that you brought up internal mobility or redeployment because, and I know we talked about not sitting here and solutioning, but I'm going to tell you that we've got plenty of customers who use, for example, Sense's job matching algorithm, where the idea is, okay, you've been in this job for 2 years. What else do you want to do? And as Chris, you're not going to know the 4,000 other opportunities that Checkr or your company has available for you, but technology can essentially go, Chris, here are 3 jobs that really fit what you've learned in the last 2 years. Do you want to consider any one of those? So, so I mean, and that's in a way for you to attract the most quality candidates to your jobs.
Yeah, and if it takes HR understanding that technology is there, so you have to actually press the technology into the process.
Right.
So from a TA strategy, you have to say, hey, it's okay if Chris becomes like a fractional resource, and like it has to not be like, it's not always a wholesale move, right? So I think that's fair, right? A wholesale move. Chris was an A today and he's a B tomorrow. But I think where it gets really interesting is when you start unlocking, I think Josh Burson a few years called it the pixelated workforce, right? Which is super normal in gig and super normal in staffing. But if you begin to unlock that strategy in corporate recruiting as well, things get really, really, really interesting because now you're allowing folks to flex and move and you're getting the best of them and not dragging them down. An example for me was always project management. Back in the days when I did project management, I was really good at running the boardroom. I was really good at being in front of the customers, but I hated Microsoft Project.
Yeah.
So if you could I could run at 50% capacity on Microsoft Project, but 110% if you put me on the road. So being able to recognize that and split that human into two, because there's PMs that love to do Microsoft Project, but they hate being in front of customers. So if you can get that strategic with the technology like that, things get cool.
Yep. Okay, so let's talk about we talked about quality. Let's talk about speed. This is probably my sort of biggest beef, right? I mean, hiring is absolutely inefficient. And this is even when you get into the hiring process. A whopping 60%, 61% actually of the candidates will report that once they applied to your company, they don't even hear back. So they literally took the time to go to your website or they stumbled across it, whatever happened, they're there, they looked at a job, they feel like this is the job that they want. And they essentially go ahead and apply for that job. And nearly 60% of them won't even hear back. Mm-hmm. And then, it's very well known. I mean, SHRM has a lot of this data that typically positions will take, 6 weeks to get filled, like, 40, 42 days. Obviously, that depends on, what kind of roles you're filling, but it is just an inefficient process. Much of this time is spent on administrative tasks, just going back and forth, just scheduling people, rescheduling people, and every single thing is a bottleneck. I mean, hey, this one candidate hasn't responded to this one question I asked, and until this candidate responds, I'm not going to move anything forward. And that's going to add another 4 things into your hiring process, whereas somebody else, on the other hand, might be or some other competitor of yours might be moving super fast. And at the end of the day, whatever you do, as long as if your hiring process is slow, whatever led it to being slow, it gives a poor candidate experience. The candidate is essentially thinking you don't have your ducks in a row, right? So this to me is one of the biggest challenges, because there are some forward-thinking companies who are now starting to talk about, hey, we got to get from hello to hire in 5 minutes. Somebody says hello to us for the very first time on a website, on a job board, in a QR code, on a text to apply chatbot. They say hello to us. Within 5 minutes, we either hire them, or within 5 minutes, we give them a disposition and say, we're interested in you. You pick the time you want to talk to a recruiter, or we're not interested in you. Go look at some other jobs we have. So, Mick, I'll come back to you as the business guy, as the buyer. I mean, what impact do you think the slow hiring process has on business?
Well, especially in high volume business. I mean, I think slow hiring in high tech and things like that, where you're hiring one-offs, it can be crippling simply because you're not getting that one piece of technology, that one brain you need in your operation. But let's talk about, we've been talking more about high volume hire, and I think, especially if we're talking hello to hire in 5 minutes, clearly that's a high volume hire. It's financially crippling. I mean, again, I'll go back to my previous comment that we ask people to come to work, do a good job, and generate revenue for the company. If people are not getting hired within the budgeted amount of time, then you're obviously not meeting your revenue budgets. And that's not a boardroom I want to be in. So yeah, it's pretty obvious that slow hiring is just tremendously negative. There's nothing positive about slow hiring.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, any other challenges that slow down hiring? I mean, your whole company is based on something that takes the friction out of a pretty outdated process.
Yeah, I have the speed conversation literally every day with Checkr, sometimes all day, every day. But I think, one of the things that I've seen is that people are always looking for the easy button on how to increase speed. But the truth of the matter is, when I say easy button, they're like, well, what's the thing I can buy that makes me fast, right? Or makes it easy? And it's like, well, it's actually the sum of all the changes you need to make. And that's usually comes around like the sophistication of the tech stack, right?
Yep.
And as you said, it's like something as simple as coordinating calendars. If you're still coordinating calendars in a manual process, you need to automate it. Absolutely. Because once you have a candidate interested, you have to get the interviews booked ASAP, because you can't let the candidate cool off. I kind of go back to one of those sales mantras, either always be closing or time kills all deals, right? If anybody is in sales, that no news is always going to be bad news. So if I'm not hearing something back from somebody, I'm definitely going to continue looking at opportunities. Maybe there's that one opportunity that I'm holding out for, but I don't hear anything for a week, or something gets backlogged, or something gets really sticky, and I'm going to take that offer that maybe was my second best. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important to focus on the top candidates while keeping the others warm, but you need to make sure that you have the right technology or the right process so that recruiters aren't spread so thin that everyone becomes cold, right? You can actually kind of work too hard and end up, and it really kind of screwing up the entire process. So bringing it a little bit closer to me with the background check, for many folks, I see this all the time, it's still a very, very manual process when it really just doesn't need to be. And I think the issue is that a lot of people are just generally kind of just stuck in, they're just kind of stuck in place, right? They're used to doing background checks at very, kind of the way I've been doing for 25 years. I want to do these things, and they're leery of trusting technology, but the tech actually does really good stuff. It's very similar to the way we're super familiar now using conversational AI to do a bit of that pre-screening. The background check can begin to unlock capacity in very similar ways so that recruiters can start to do the human things that they need to do. And a really good example, there's no reason the background check process needs to stop at 5 p.m. on Friday. And the fact of the matter is that it does. There's a lot of background check shops out there. I'm not making this about Checkr. I'm just making it about tech-enabled background check versus not tech-enabled background check. For a lot of regional shops, the background check you requested at 5 o'clock on Friday, they're not looking at it until Monday morning. The tech-enabled background shops, they begin creating that identity immediately, and they run through the weekend. They create the identity. They start going through and building the profile and pulling the stuff from the databases, pulling the data that they can that's actually online. So they're already 2 days ahead from the offline background check companies. So yeah. I think that's a really big friction point there, but then also looking at the adjudication, which I think we'll kind of dig in a little bit later in the session, but adjudication is another one of those areas where people just want to do it manually. And it's like, man, there's a really good way to kind of unlock that go, no go decision on a candidate with technology. But the cool thing is, if you're using technology there as well, you're also reducing that risk for bias as well, because that adjudication process, like that go, no go on Chris, that is probably the highest risk area for bias to come into the hiring process.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the whole 9 to 5 thing, because one of the biggest examples that I've noticed during the pandemic is there are hundreds of customers of ours who are in the healthcare space. Nobody there was working 9 to 5. The healthcare workers were getting their break at midnight. And that's when they wanted to talk to somebody and say, I want to change my job. I want to do something different. They have no recruiter to talk to. But you know what? They could talk to a conversational AI assistant. They could talk to an AI assistant and say, here is a job I want. Here are my credentials. Am I willing to travel or not? Here is the amount of money I want. And if you kind of went through a pre-screening process, the AI would talk to you and essentially say, great, pick a time that works for you to spend 15 minutes with our recruiter. You can pick your own time and say, I know I can take a 15-minute break on Thursday at 3 p.m. and that's the time I'll take. So, this, when we talk about how technology can help with this, I mean, you talked a lot about this, but you absolutely have to use AI to automate the entire application process. And secondly, most candidates want an omni-channel strategy now, right? I mean, there is such a consumerization of the hiring process now. People expect the same treatment from a recruiting workflow as they expect from Amazon.com. Hey, if I ask you to text me, don't email me. If I ask you to email me, don't text me. Just remember my preferences. So you've got to build a tech stack, just like the way you mentioned, where you have to build everything in your tech stack to say, depending on your preference, I can communicate with you via email, via text, via a survey, via a chat bot, via WhatsApp, via Facebook Messenger, whatever the case might be, and just meet people where they are, like your son who's on TikTok. And then the last thing I was going to say was, I mean, as you do this using conversational AI, and by the way, I'm not sitting here saying conversational AI can replace everything a recruiter does, but I will sit here and tell you that we've had millions of conversations over a chatbot, over a conversational recruiting assistant. And after millions of conversations, the average review for a chatbot is 4.8 on a scale of 5. No recruiter is ever going to get that, because candidates crave this idea that within 30 seconds, you can give me a disposition and tell me whether you're interested in me or not. So, while we're talking about speed, Mick, I'll throw this back at you. What's the biggest lag in the candidate funnel that you see, and how can one resolve that bottleneck?
Well, for me, initially the biggest lag that I've run into in my career was that initial screening, going through the applications, wasted time on unqualified applicants. How can you fix that? The AI that you two have just been discussing. It's probably the most accurate way, the most unbiased way, and the way with the least liability. If you don't have a human being sitting there, and I'll go back to the days of paper applications. I mean, those did exist at one time.
I remember.
You go down to the box where somebody would check, I've been arrested or I've been convicted of a felony. That stuff is pretty much all gone away now.
Yeah.
But as a compliance guy, that box used to keep me up at night. Because I would figure, any lawsuit was probably coming, in the hiring process was probably coming from that box, whether it be from the federal government, a state government, or an individual applicant. So AI eliminates that. And I'll go back to Chris's comment on tech-enabled background checks. You're going to get much more accuracy, you're going to get much more speed, and you're going to get much less liability. And again, my perspective on this whole deal is protect the company, protect the employee, and do everything the right way. So speed it up, take the bias out of it, and improve your accuracy.
Awesome.
The only way you can do that is to automate.
Yep, well said. All right, before we start talking about equity, so Chris, just philosophically for you, I mean, do you think hiring's gotten more efficient or less efficient recently?
It's a loaded question. I want to say yes, so I'm going to say we're making good headway. I think there is really good solutions that were popping up. I mean, we've all been in HR tech a long time. I think there's a lot of good stuff. Sense is an example, Checkr example. I mean, there's a lot of good technology solutions that are out there. But the problem is that adoption was somewhat low, right? I mean, obviously, huge saturation in staffing, huge saturation in gig for Checkr. But I think that there's a difference between digital investment versus digital transformation. And I think, we were making really good headway into people were beginning to transform and saying, whoa, how can I build these really cool tech stacks? How can I convert my process? How can I take the technology and build it into my process? But then COVID happened, and then the Great Resignation happened, and it's like we woke up overnight, and now half the workforce is Gen Z. It's an army of my son walking around out there. So I think the goalposts got moved. So we're kind of like, I think we reset the bar just a little bit on kind of where we are from an efficiency standpoint, because I think that tools and the adoption was out there. It was maybe calibrated for where we were, I'll lose track of time, 2 years ago, pre-pandemic, right? Like, I feel like the last 2 years were really like 2 months. So I think we're calibrated there, and now we need to recalibrate for what's happening. It's a consumer-like experience, consumer-like and data-driven in ways that we've never seen before. It's all the things we talked about kind of upstream on this session around unlocking the pixelated workforce, speaking to Gen Z. I think we're good philosophically, but I think there's more work to do now, only because the goalpost is another 100 yards down field. So I'm looking forward to HR Tech this year. I'm kind of curious to see if there's some new solutions that are out there that now we can begin to fold into that, but it just puts the pressure on the folks on the call. If you're an HR professional, you need to solve the problems from 2 years ago and solve the problems for the next 2 years as well, all at once.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for that perspective. Okay, so let's jump into, I think the part that gets talked about the least, which is equity, right? I mean, we all know that even the most well-intentioned people, have some sort of unconscious bias. They can make judgments based on ethnicity, based on gender, based on education background. My favorite is I literally hear people tell me, hey, I'm a 49ers fan, and if I see on a resume that somebody else supports another support, I'm here, like things that they probably think are a joke, but it obviously introduces some amount of bias in the conversation. So, there are obviously. The second challenge here is the largest one that we've talked about, which is it's the one thing that ends up taking a backseat. You will prioritize speed over equity, you'll prioritize quality over equity, you'll sometimes prioritize speed and quality over equity, but you essentially don't give it, the credit that it deserves. And then lastly, we just get so many applicants now. I just told you that 60% of the people don't even get a response from the company. So it just leads to a poor candidate experience, which actually leads to sort of inequity, right? I mean, there are people who got a response versus people who didn't, and maybe the best candidate was sitting in the people that you didn't respond to. So again, I mean, this is a big passion area for us now, because obviously you can use conversational AI to somewhat reduce a bias. You can use an omni-channel strategy to reduce bias. But Chris, I'll go back to you again. Are companies getting better at hiring equity? What do you see, or where can other improvements be made here?
Yeah, I think companies are doing 100% better, but we're still really far from done. I think there's been good progress around sort of the top level, right, from an equality standpoint. So what I mean by that is race and gender, which is amazing, right? That was a massive thing that we needed to unlock. But I'm a firm believer that there's different layers to equitable hiring. So there's certainly race and gender. But as you dig in, there's also neurodiversity, there's age, there's experience, even geolocation. These are really all ingredients to a diverse workforce. So for example, neurodiversity is one that I'm personally passionate about. And for me, I cherish every opportunity I have to work with people that are neurodiverse. And it's one of those things like, how are you actually capturing that information? How are you recognizing it? And then how are you folding that into your equitable hiring process? As you said, is there a 49ers poster up behind me? It's like, if you're interviewing, it's very clear that there's some you have neurodivergency going on there. And I think it's important for us to recognize that and celebrate that as well. I think one of the other big areas for me from an equitable hiring standpoint is justice impacted candidates. If you know anything about Checkr, we're super passionate about this. 1 in 3 Americans have a criminal record. So if you look at your screening requirements, and if you're one of those companies that's sitting there saying any criminality, you're out of the mix, well, that's bias. I mean, I hate to say it, but it truly is, right? Because if you really take a look at individualized assessment, and you make this a requirement in your hiring process and start to Pankaj, you said it earlier in the presentation, listening and knowing, kind of getting in the hearts and the minds of the candidates, you really, really, really need to do that. So like I said, I think we're doing really well. The awareness is there. It's being driven from the top down. I think we've made really big swings in the big rocks, but there are some smaller rocks yet that I think at scale, we still need to continue to kind of flip up and fold into those processes.
Awesome. Mick, any thoughts to add on challenges with equity?
No. Yeah, I think Chris has captured it well. I mean, a big part of equity, or one of the advantages of being equitable, is putting the right person in the right position at the right time, right? Well, if you put the wrong person in the wrong position even if it's at the right time, you're going to get the wrong. Again, I come from the profit-based world. You're going to end up with liability. You're going to end up with reduced revenue. Equity is critical. But it is, I agree with Chris. I think we're making a lot of progress. Lots more to go.
Got it. Perfect. All right. So I'll offer some thoughts on, essentially using technology to solve for equity, or sort of introduce equity, if you will. The first one's pretty obvious. Use an automated process, use some conversational AI to reduce bias. I mean, a chatbot does not have a bias against whether this candidate is a female or a male, whether this candidate is older or younger, whether this candidate is from a particular sports team, so on and so forth. So at the very least, you're going to get these people through a pre-screening conversation, and people who clear the pre-screening will at least get into your recruitment pipeline. And if they're in the recruitment pipeline, they get to talk to a recruiter. Hopefully the rest of it is easy, because now you're face-to-face with a person and you can have a real conversation. Not to mention what we've talked about before, that the second thing it does is it actually makes sure that everybody gets a fair chance. Those 60% of the people who weren't even going to be able to hear back from you are at least getting pre-screened. And maybe the conversational assistant can come up and say, here are 15 just rock star people that I found, however you're building your chatbots, and at least it can pop them in front of you. Second, automation just automatically gives everybody a fair chance, right? I mean, this idea that I like your resume better than the other person, or formatting better than the other person, or where you came from better than the other person, or a referral better than the other person. Well, as long as I'm answering the same exact question and I'm doing a better job than this other person who seemingly has better things going on, I will be in the running. So it's a more fair, it's a more sort of fair process, and obviously everybody gets a response. Now, one thing I would say is, even though we build this technology, I don't want to be the one sitting here saying this is a panacea and this is a cure-all. Automation can solve many challenges, but to truly achieve equity, you just have to do other things beyond technology. You actually have to have a commitment to diversity. You actually have to train interviewers on what kind of questions they're asking. Dell, which is one of our customers, their CEO, Michael Dell, has stood up and said by 2030, which feels like it's around the corner, 50% of their workforce will be women. 25% of them, would be sort of, Latino and diverse. 25% of their executives would be women and diverse. I mean, it's just a big, hairy, audacious goal that they've just put in front of themselves, and they're now changing their entire company and their hiring process towards that. So while technology can help, you obviously need to have this come from the top down. But as long as we are talking technology, Chris, any other nuggets on how technology can reduce bias?
I mean, I can't answer this without talking about Checkr a little bit. So not an ad, but I am just going to talk about a feature, right? And again, this is one of the ways that we solve this problem. So if you take a look at adjudication, we hear some absolute horror stories. And I want to talk about adjudication. It's that go, no go, right? It's the background check comes in. Obviously, that's always the truth, right? That's the system of record from the courthouses. And then as an organization, or as a customer, or maybe for the role, you're saying, hey, these are the things that are good. These are the things that are bad. Well, kind of like, the San Francisco Giants, or the 49ers, sorry, that is where that bias happens. It's me, right? And it's the animals, right? It's fish and game kind of pops up there. It's maybe I've got a problem, it's where you're from. But what we've done is, as an organization, you can go in and actually configure those adjudication matrices ahead of time. So if the organization says, hey, you know what, we're a driver network company, we're delivering things, but we generally as a company, we don't care about DUIs that are over 5 years ago. But perhaps there's somebody that's on the screen team or in the recruitment process that's been impacted by a drunk driver, and they may try to inject their own adjudication into that process. So we've created those filters so that you're only seeing the things that the company actually cares about. So you're not going to, that DUI that comes in, and if I had one 7 years ago, it's going to go auto clear. So that way I never have an opportunity to input my own personal bias into that. And that's not like anything that's like super sophisticated. It's just an elegant solution with some technology. I mean, there's some sophistication that works behind the curtain, like how do you get there with standard charge classifications and stuff. But I think when you look at how technology can solve problems, you need to, that's why I said you need to look at the sum of the total. So it's going to be things like conversational AI. It's going to be things like outreach with that. It's going to be things like indexing skills to rec gaps, but then also look at some of the things that are more classically commoditized, right? Like the background check, and say, can this actually have a positive impact on us reducing bias and having more equitable hiring? And the answer is full stop, yes, right? If you partner with the right folks. And I'll just go ahead and say that's Checkr as for one, but really any of the tech-enabled background check companies.
Awesome. Mick, any thoughts? I actually know you have some personal experience with how chatbots have reduced, time to hire and whatnot.
Well, AI certainly reduced time to hire from, and probably time to offer from 3 days to 20 minutes to time to hire from 5 days down to 2 days. Part of that 2 days was actually Chris's Checkr background process. And we're talking 8,000 to 9,000 employees a year. I worked for a business process outsourcing company, and in the off season we'd have 1,500 employees, and in the high season we'd have 6,000 or 7,000 employees. And when you're ramping up in a 90-day period, Checkr gets a lot of business. But also, if you can imagine, you can cut your HR recruiting staff significantly when the first 60% is being done by AI. So yeah, you mentioned earlier about companies going from hello to hire in 5 minutes.
Right.
Well, we probably went from hello to offer in 10 to 15.
That's amazing.
But clients have a lot of background requirements, especially in the healthcare industry and things like that. So you can't actually start putting someone into your HRIS until Chris's people come back, and drug testing as well.
Right.
So, but yeah, it was transformative for us personally.
Awesome. Thank you both of you for sharing that perspective. But before I let you go, we've gotten some really cool questions from the audience, and I'll just throw them out there. So not necessarily at one person versus the other, but whoever wants to take it. Here is, I guess, a very pertinent question. Somebody asked, can you share an example of companies you've seen that excel in these areas?
Firsthand knowledge, obviously I couldn't share that because I have all sorts of paperwork around that. But I think if you look at a lot of the companies that are becoming household names, right? If you look at the gig type companies, right? Obviously, it's amazing what Michael Dell's doing at Dell, but that's turning the aircraft carrier. If you take a look at a lot of the companies based in Silicon Valley, the smaller companies, they're turning on a dime to be able to do this, because that is an absolute cutthroat industry. Very similar to staffing. Staffing's now beginning to sort of catch up with that, right? Because they're looking at the gig and saying, wow, I just lost, double-digit numbers of my funnel to the gig platforms. And the gig platforms are saying, geez, it's a knife fight between each other, because you have a car, you can work for any one of them. So if you take a look at what they're doing, they've consumerized that process. They're tech-enabled. They're treating it like Amazon, right? We used to say be the Uber of HR. I think now the answer is more like be the Amazon of HR. And they're now beginning to do that. They're making data-driven decisions. Certainly there's a big social alignment thing. So yeah, if you wanted to kind of look at for like what good looks like, just go kind of pop around, look for white papers, look for thought leaders that are like talking about what they're doing. That's a good place to start. Just, sort of quickly off the top of my head.
That's awesome. Mick, this one's for you, and I know you work for really large companies, but here is somebody asking that, with a little bit of a twist. How do growing/emerging companies think about integrating quality, speed, and hiring, or quality, speed, and equity into hiring practices?
Well, if you're growing and small, that's the perfect time to get hold of somebody with some AI and get it going immediately. It's not expensive. It's certainly less expensive than adding that next recruiter. Get it going while you're young and nimble. Before, I heard Chris just say Michael Dell is turning the aircraft carrier. Well, turn the speedboat.
Right. Yeah.
Much simpler, much quicker. Get it going now. The longer you wait, the more painful it's going to be, the more it's going to cost you, the more your implementation is going to be, and you're going to waste money on probably human resources that you probably will find you don't need. Forget the legal side, and again, that's my background, so I always go to liability. Forget that side of it. Just from a process improvement standpoint, get it done now.
Yep. No, that's very sound advice. I like how you think about it. It's easy to incorporate that in your process before you become a giant, and might as well start it the right way.
It's much simpler to start from the foundation than have to rebuild the foundation after the building's built.
That's right. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I'll ask this one question that, for the both of you, so I'll let you guys go at it one after the other. Is there one tip that you want to leave our audience with that can help them achieve, success in hiring?
Yeah, I would just say, be curious. In my career, I have worked with literally hundreds and hundreds of HR professionals and seen just as many HR processes. With my time at Checkr, I'm still seeing them, right? So maybe I'm up to the thousands now. And I think one of the biggest impediments to doing what we're doing is people just stop being curious and they get comfortable. And it's more of a change management kind of challenger statement than probably technology or anything else. But just be comfortable getting off autopilot. So when you hop off something like this, say, hey, I don't know, let me go look at my screening requirements. Hey, let me go look at my resumes. Like take some of these notes and actually go and ask questions on why, and then figure out, what you can do about it. I saw somebody at HR Tech one time said, if it might've been Josh Burson, actually, I think he said, if it's not broken, fix it. That might have been SIA. It might have been SIA, actually. If it's not broken, fix it. And I just kind of stuck with me, and I'm like, yeah, it's cool. Fix everything. So everything can be changed.
Awesome. Yep. Make 30 seconds for you.
Yeah. Don't be satisfied. I think that fits in with what Chris said. Good is never good enough. But that's enough cliches. One of the things we were talking about earlier was, how can I increase my funnel? I never heard anybody talk about, go look at your website. Are you still in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s? Is your website, are you drawing people in? What kind of website traffic do you have, guys? Take a hard look at what you're telling people, what your story is out there that you are preaching to the world. What are candidates when they research you, because they are, what are they looking at? Take a very hard look at that, and make sure that your website is exactly what you want it to be. And that's just a practical tip.
Awesome.
People are always looking for that next magic bullet. Well, there are no silver bullets. There are 10 little things that will make up a magic bullet.
That's awesome. Very well said. Thank you. At the interest of time, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us. You have the email addresses of all three of us, and I say this on behalf of everybody that we'll all be happy and delighted to answer any questions that anyone might have. And with that, Chris and Mick, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for lending your expertise. Always a pleasure talking to you both. And with that, we'll call it a day.
Great. Thanks all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.